The rain had not stopped for 3 days. It came in sideways off the Savannah River, a gray and indifferent assault that turned the red Georgia clay into something almost black, something that sucked at the wheels of wagons and swallowed the footprints of men before they were fully made. The live oaks along the drive to Willow Creek plantation hung heavy with moss that dripped like the tattered hems of a widow's dress, and the light, what little there was of it, arrived in pale, bruised sheets that barely reached the ground. It was the winter of 1847. January. The kind of cold that did not announce itself so much as simply settle, the way a stone settles into mud, quietly and without ceremony, until you realized you had not been warm in days. A boy stood at the edge of the tree line. He was small, not yet 10 years old, though no one had ever written down the exact date of his birth, and so no one could say with certainty. He wore a rough cotton shirt that hung past his knees, threadbare at the shoulders, and his feet were bare against the frozen earth. He did not shiver. He had learned long ago that shivering was something you could not afford, not because it was forbidden, but because it drew attention, and attention, in the world where Thomas lived, was the most dangerous thing in the world. He was watching something. Across the yard, beyond the great house with its white columns and its dark windows, beyond the smokehouse and the water trough, there was a building that no enslaved person on Willow Creek had ever been permitted to enter. It was small, no larger than a smokehouse itself, with a single window of wavy glass and a door of unpainted pine. The overseer's office. Inside that office, on a desk that Thomas had never seen but somehow knew existed the way a rabbit knows where the fox sleeps, there were papers. Documents. The ledgers in which every soul on this plantation was recorded, not by name, not always, but by value. Thomas had not come to watch the office. He had come to watch the men inside it. Mr. Caleb Wren sat at his desk with a candle burning close to his right hand. He was writing. His hand moved in long, careful strokes, and every so often he would pause, dip the quill, and continue. He was a thin man, Wren, thin in the way a blade is thin, not from weakness but from a kind of deliberate sharpness. He had come to Willow Creek 3 years before, hired by Colonel Ashworth to manage the 412 acres and the 131 souls who worked them. He did his work with precision. He did not shout. He did not curse. He carried a leather strap folded twice and tucked into his belt, and Thomas had seen it used exactly 7 times in 3 years. 7 times was not often. But the silence with which Wren administered punishment was worse than any roaring. It was the silence of a man who had already decided what you were worth, and had already written it down. Thomas watched him write. He watched for a long time, long enough for the candle to burn an inch lower, long enough for the rain to find its way through the collar of his shirt. And then something happened that Thomas had never seen before and would not forget for the rest of his life. Wren stopped writing. He set down the quill. He turned in his chair and looked, not out the window toward the quarters, not toward the great house, but directly, precisely, at the tree line where Thomas stood. The boy did not move. He did not breathe. Wren held the gaze for 3 full seconds. Then he turned back to his desk and continued to write. Thomas did not know if the men had truly seen him. The distance was 40 yards. The light was poor. It was possible, likely, even, that Wren had merely glanced in that direction, the way a man glances at anything that moves in his peripheral vision. But Thomas carried the moment with him like a stone in his pocket for the rest of that winter, turning it over and over, because there was something in that glance, something cold and knowing, that told him the men had seen exactly what he saw, a child who was watching. A child who was paying attention. And on Willow Creek Plantation, in the state of Georgia, in the year of our Lord 1847, a child who paid too much attention was a child in danger. Thomas had not always known his mother's name. This is not because she had no name. Her name was Phoebe. She had given it to him herself, in the way that enslaved mothers gave their children the only inheritance they could, spoken, not written, passed in whispers during the dark hours when the overseer's ears were turned elsewhere. My name is Phoebe. You remember that. You remember me. Phoebe had been born on a rice plantation near Beaufort, South Carolina, in approximately 1832, no one recorded the month or the day. She had been sold once before Thomas was born, at the age of 14, moved from one set of hands to another the way a piece of good cotton cloth might be moved, assessed, valued, transferred. She did not cry when she was sold. She had already learned that crying did not change the arithmetic of the auction block. She arrived at Willow Creek in 1836, purchased by Colonel Beauregard Ashworth as part of a larger transaction involving 12 field hands and a blacksmith. Colonel Ashworth was not a cruel man by the standards of his class and time. He was, in fact, considered something of a moderate, a man who did not sell children away from their mothers if he could avoid it, who permitted his enslaved people a small garden plot behind the quarters, who allowed them to keep whatever they caught in the creek on Sundays. These were not kindnesses. They were calculations. A contented laborer worked harder and sickened less than a miserable one, and Colonel Ashworth understood this the way he understood soil composition and cotton futures. His gentility was, like everything else on Willow Creek, a matter of good management. Thomas was born in the spring of 1838, in the single-room cabin that Phoebe shared with 2 other women and their children. The cabin had a dirt floor, a small hearth, and a roof that leaked in 3 places. It smelled of wood smoke and red clay and the particular sour-sweet odor of too many bodies in too small a space. There was no midwife, not a paid one. An older woman named Aunt Lucille, who had birthed more children than she could count on both hands and had lost nearly as many, attended the labor. She had done this dozens of times and spoke very little during the process. She did what needed to be done, and when Thomas came into the world, small, quiet, already watchful, she wrapped him in a scrap of homespun and handed him to his mother without ceremony. "He ain't cried," Phoebe said, looking down at the child. "He will," Aunt Lucille said. But Thomas did not cry. Not then, and not for a long time afterward. It was the first sign, though no one understood it as a sign at the time, that this child was different. Thomas's father was a man named Isaiah, a field hand who had come to Willow Creek the same year as Phoebe. Isaiah was broad-shouldered and quiet, a man who did his work without complaint and kept his eyes down and his thoughts to himself. He and Phoebe were not married. Marriage among enslaved people on Willow Creek was permitted but not recorded, recognized by the people who lived there but not by the law, not by Colonel Ashworth, not by any court or document that would have meant anything to the outside world. Isaiah and Phoebe lived in separate cabins. He visited her when he could. He held his son in the evenings, after the work was done, and he taught the boy nothing except silence and patience, because those were the only lessons he knew how to give. Isaiah was sold in the autumn of 1839. Thomas was 18 months old. There was no warning. Colonel Ashworth had fallen into debt, cotton prices had dropped, a boll weevil had cut the previous year's yield by a third, and he needed to raise capital quickly. Isaiah was a strong man, 32 years old, worth a good price at market. The decision was made in the great house, over breakfast, by a man who ate eggs and toast and drank his coffee while he signed the paper that ended a family. Phoebe learned of the sale an hour before Isaiah was taken. She had time to bring Thomas to him. The child was sitting in the dirt behind the cabin, pulling apart a pine cone with deliberate concentration, and Isaiah held his son one final time. He did not say goodbye. He said nothing at all. He simply held the boy against his chest and breathed, and then he set him down, and then he walked to the wagon that would take him to the Macon market, and Thomas watched him go with those dark, still eyes that did not cry. Phoebe did not speak of Isaiah again. Not because she had forgotten him, but because memory, on a plantation, was a luxury that cost too much. You could not afford to hold on to what had been taken from you. You could only survive what remained. The plantation ran on a rhythm so regular, so precisely calibrated to the body's limits, that it felt less like a schedule and more like a heartbeat, mechanical, indifferent, unceasing. The bell rang before dawn. It was a small iron bell mounted on a post behind the overseer's office, and its sound carried across the quarters in the gray pre-light like a command from God himself, though it came from no God. It came from Mr. Wren, who rang it himself each morning at 4:30, rain or shine, winter or summer, regardless of illness or injury or grief. The bell did not care what you had lost. The bell simply rang. By the time the first light touched the tops of the live oaks, 131 people were in the fields. Thomas was too young to work the cotton that would come later, when his fingers were strong enough to pick and his back was small enough to move between the rows without damage. But he was not idle. Children on Willow Creek were put to work as soon as they could walk without falling. At 4, Thomas carried water to the field hands in a wooden bucket with a ladle. At 5, he weeded the garden plots. At 6, he fed the chickens and collected eggs. At 7, he carried messages between the great house and the quarters, small errands, meaningless in themselves, but each one a test. Could the child be trusted? Could he be sent somewhere alone and return without trouble? Could he be relied upon? Thomas could be relied upon. This was noticed. The work of cotton was not glamorous, and it was not finished. The field stretched in long, brown rows from the river bottom to the edge of the pine woods, and in the summer months, when the bolls opened white against the dark stalks, the entire plantation became a single, vast machine for harvesting. Everyone picked, men, women, children old enough to hold a sack. The sacks were weighed at the end of each day, and the weights were recorded in Mr. Wren's ledger. A man who picked less than his expected share would receive a warning the first time, a reduction in his food ration the second, and a beating the third. The system was not designed to punish. It was designed to produce. Punishment was simply the mechanism by which production was maintained. The quarters where Thomas lived were a row of 12 cabins, each one shared by 4 to 6 people. The cabins were built of rough-hewn pine, raised slightly off the ground on wooden blocks to keep the mud out, though in the wet seasons, the mud came in anyway. Each cabin had a single hearth, a single window with no glass, and a dirt floor that was swept each morning by the women and children. There were no beds. People slept on pallets of straw laid on the ground, covered by thin quilts that had been pieced together from scraps of worn-out clothing. In winter, the cold came through the walls like a living thing, and the only warmth was the fire and the bodies pressed together in the dark. Food was distributed weekly, a fixed ration of cornmeal, salt pork, and dried beans. It was enough to keep a person alive and working, but not enough to satisfy. Hunger was a constant companion on Willow Creek, a dull ache that lived in the belly and sharpened during the months when the garden plots were bare. Some families supplemented their diet with fish from the creek or game from the woods, but hunting required permission, and permission was not always given. Phoebe kept a small plot behind her cabin where she grew collard greens and sweet potatoes, tended in the thin margins of time between the end of the workday and the fall of dark. Thomas ate from this plot when there was something to eat, and went hungry when there was not. Mrs. Eleanor Ashworth, the colonel's wife, was not often seen in the quarters. She lived in the great house, behind its white columns and its tall windows, and the enslaved people who worked inside that house moved through it like ghosts, invisible and indispensable. Mrs. Ashworth was a woman of 42, thin-faced and pale, with hair the color of faded straw and hands that had never touched a hoe or a cotton sack. She was not, by any account, a woman who enjoyed cruelty. She did not beat the house servants. She did not single out individuals for punishment. But she lived in a world in which 131 human beings were her property, hers and her husband's, and she accepted this fact the way one accepts the weather, as a condition of existence, unpleasant perhaps, but not something to be questioned. She prayed on Sundays. She read scripture. She believed, genuinely and without irony, that God had ordained the order of the world, and that the order of the world included the ownership of colored people by white ones. She was not a monster. She was something perhaps more dangerous than a monster. She was ordinary. By the time Thomas was 7 years old, he had developed a skill that no one on Willow Creek could have predicted, and that no one, not Phoebe, not Aunt Lucille, not even Mr. Wren, would have thought possible for a child born into the dirt and silence of the slave quarters. He could read. Not well. Not at first. The ability arrived in fragments, the way dawn arrives, not all at once, but in degrees, each one imperceptible until suddenly the darkness was gone and the light was there, and you could not say precisely when the change had happened. It began with listening. Thomas listened the way other children watched or played, with his entire body, every sense turned inward, gathering sound the way a sponge gathers water. He listened to the overseer giving instructions in the morning, and he memorized not only the words but the weight of them, the way certain phrases carried authority and others did not. He listened to Mrs. Ashworth when she came to the quarters to inspect the cabins, and he noted how she spoke to the enslaved people, not with anger, but with a kind of benign distance, as though she were speaking to furniture that had learned to stand upright. He listened to the white children who played in the yard of the great house, and he noticed that they spoke in a different register than the people in the quarters, faster, louder, with a confidence that came from knowing the world belonged to them. And he listened to the church. Colonel Ashworth permitted his enslaved people to attend services on Sunday mornings, held in a small wooden chapel at the edge of the property. The preacher was a white man named Reverend Harmon, a thin, reedy figure who came from Milledgeville twice a month and spoke with the fervor of a man who genuinely believed he was saving souls. He preached from the Bible, King James, the only version Thomas had ever heard, and he read passages aloud in a voice that rose and fell like wine through the pines. Thomas sat in the back of the chapel, on a rough-hewn bench, and he listened to every word. He did not understand all of it. But he understood the shape of the language, the way the sentences curved and turned, the way certain words carried more weight than others. He carried those words inside him like seeds, and he waited for the soil in which they might grow. The soil came from an unlikely source. In the summer of 1845, when Thomas was 7, Mrs. Ashworth began teaching the enslaved children on the plantation their letters. This was not, as one might imagine, an act of generosity. It was a practical measure. Cotton records needed to be kept. Correspondence needed to be sent and received. The colonel was growing older, and his eyesight was failing, and he needed people who could assist with the small administrative tasks that kept a plantation running. Teaching a handful of enslaved children to read and write was an investment, no different, in the colonel's mind, from buying a new plow or repairing a fence. The lessons were held in the kitchen of the great house, on Tuesday and Thursday afternoons, while the field hands worked. 5 children were selected. Thomas was one of them, chosen, he later understood, because Mrs. Ashworth had noticed him listening. She had noticed, and she had told her husband, and the colonel had added Thomas's name to the small list of children who would learn their letters. The lessons lasted 1 hour. Mrs. Ashworth did not teach them herself. She sent a house servant named June, a woman of 30 who had learned to read years before and who could write in a careful, looping hand. June sat at the kitchen table with a slate and a piece of chalk, and she taught the 5 children the alphabet, 1 letter at a time, with a patience that surprised no one who knew her. June was not unkind. She was not generous, either. She simply did what she was told, and what she was told was to teach these children their letters so that they might be useful. Thomas learned faster than the others. Within 3 months, he knew the alphabet. Within 6, he could sound out simple words. Within a year, he could read short sentences, slowly, laboriously, his lips moving as he worked through each syllable, but reading nonetheless. June noticed this. She said nothing to Mrs. Ashworth about it, because June understood something that the mistress did not. A Negro child who could read too well was not an asset. It was a threat. But June did something else. Something quiet, and small, and enormously dangerous. She began leaving books where Thomas could find them. Not all at once. Not obviously. A hymnal left open on the kitchen windowsill when Thomas came in to sweep. A copy of a children's Bible, its cover worn soft as cloth, tucked behind a basket of kindling in the woodshed where Thomas fetched firewood each evening. Once, only once, a thin volume of poetry, its pages yellowed and brittle, slipped into the pocket of a coat that hung on a peg near the back door. Thomas found it 3 days later, when the coat was given to him to mend. He held the book in his hands for a long time before he opened it, as though it were a living thing that might bite. He read it in secret, by firelight, after Phoebe and the others in the cabin had gone to sleep. He read slowly, sounding out words he did not know, holding the meaning of each sentence in his mind the way a man holds water in cupped hands, carefully, knowing that any carelessness would lose it. He understood, even at 7 years old, that what he was doing was forbidden. He understood that if Mr. Wren found him with a book, the consequence would not be a warning or a reduction in rations. The consequence would be something much worse. And so he read in the dark, and he kept the books hidden, and he told no one, not Phoebe, not Aunt Lucille, not anyone. The secret lived inside him like a small, bright flame, burning in a place where no one could see it. The years passed the way years pass on a plantation, slowly, and all at once. Thomas grew. He moved from carrying water to working the rows, from the rows to the gin house, from the gin house to the fields. His body changed, lengthened, hardened, grew lean and strong in the way that enslaved bodies grew, shaped not by choice but by the unceasing demands of the work. By the time he was 12, he could pick 200 pounds of cotton in a day. By 13, he could work from dawn to dark without complaint, without rest, without the flicker of rebellion that Mr. Wren watched for so carefully in every pair of eyes. But Thomas's body was not the only thing that changed. His mind, that quiet, absorbing mind that had listened and watched and memorized since before he could speak, grew as well, and it grew in directions that no one on Willow Creek could have predicted. He read everything he could find. Hymnal pages torn from their bindings and hidden in the lining of his shirt. A fragment of a newspaper, found in the road after a white man's horse had dropped it, creased and muddy but still legible. A passage from the book of Exodus that June had written on a scrap of brown paper and slipped to him during a Sunday service, her hand brushing his as she pressed it into his palm. Thomas read these fragments the way a starving man eats, desperately, completely, leaving nothing behind. He did not tell anyone what he read. He did not tell anyone what he understood. He carried his knowledge inside him like a second skin, invisible to the world, known only to him and to June, who continued to pass him scraps and fragments through the years with the quiet, methodical care of a woman who understood exactly what she was doing and why. June died in the winter of 1848, of a fever that swept through the quarters and took 11 people in 6 weeks. Thomas was 10 years old. He did not cry at her funeral. There was no funeral, only a brief gathering at the edge of the burial ground behind the chapel, where Reverend Harmon said a few words and the earth was shoveled over the pine box. Thomas stood at the back of the crowd and held the grief inside him, the way he held everything, quietly, deeply, without show. After June was gone, Thomas found no more books. The lessons with the enslaved children had ended by then. Mrs. Ashworth had grown tired of the experiment, or the Colonel had decided it was no longer necessary, or some combination of both. The knowledge Thomas had acquired was his alone, and he guarded it with a vigilance that never wavered. He did not know, then, how much that knowledge would cost him. The first sign came in the spring of 1849, when Thomas was 11. He had been sent to the great house to deliver a message from Mr. Wren, a minor errand, nothing unusual. He walked up the drive in the afternoon heat, his bare feet white with dust, and knocked at the servants' entrance as he had been taught to do. The door opened, and he was admitted to the back hallway, and he waited, as he had been taught to wait, with his eyes down and his hands at his sides. He waited for 15 minutes. The message was delivered. And then, as he turned to leave, he passed an open doorway. Inside the room, the Colonel's study, a place he had never entered and never expected to enter, there were papers on the desk. Dozens of them. Ledgers, letters, documents of all kinds, spread across the surface in a careful arrangement that Thomas could see, even in the brief moment of his passing, formed words and numbers. He did not stop. He did not look. He walked past the doorway and out the servants' entrance and back down the drive, and he did not look back. But he had seen the papers. And in the days that followed, he found himself thinking about them, about what they contained, about what they meant, about the ledgers in which every soul on this plantation was recorded as property. He thought about Colonel Ashworth's signature at the bottom of those pages. He thought about what it meant to be written down, to exist, in the eyes of the law, as a line in a book, a number beside a name, a value in dollars and cents. He thought about Isaiah, his father, who had been sold with no more ceremony than a piece of good timber. He thought about Phoebe, his mother, who had been purchased at market like a bolt of cloth. He thought about himself, Thomas, age 11, worth perhaps $200 at current market prices, depending on his health and his strength and the price of cotton. And for the first time in his life, Thomas felt something that was not silence or patience or watchfulness. He felt something that burned, quietly and steadily, like a coal in the dark. He did not have a name for it yet. But it was there, and it would not go away. Mr. Caleb Wren kept his records with meticulous care. Every birth, every death, every sale, every punishment, every day of sickness that reduced a worker's output, All of it was recorded in a series of leather-bound ledgers that filled a shelf in his office behind the great house. The ledgers were written in a small, precise hand, the ink brown and faded in the older volumes, black and sharp in the newer ones. They were, in every sense that mattered to the law, the true history of Willow Creek plantation. They told the story of the place not as it was lived, not the grief, not the silence, not the small acts of resistance and love that sustained the people who worked the land, but as it was owned. As it was managed. As it was, in the language of commerce, productive. Thomas had never seen the inside of Wren's office. But he knew it existed, and he knew what was kept there, and by the time he was 12, he had begun to understand something about those ledgers that went beyond their function as records of property. They were the only story that would survive. This understanding came to him gradually, in the way his reading had come, not as a sudden revelation but as a slow, accumulating awareness. He understood that when he was gone, when all of them were gone, every person in the quarters, every man and woman and child who had worked this land and slept in these cabins and eaten this food, the only evidence that they had ever existed would be the ledgers. Not their names, necessarily. Not their stories. Just numbers. Just values. A line in a book that said, one Negro male, age 12, field hand, value $200. And Thomas understood, with a clarity that frightened him, that this was not enough. That this could not be enough. That somewhere, somehow, the truth of what had happened here, the truth of what had been done to the people who lived on this land, had to be written down. Not in a ledger. Not in the language of commerce. But in words that meant something. In words that could not be reduced to a number or a value or a line in a book. He began to write. He did this in secret, as he did everything, carefully, quietly, in the margins of time when no one was watching. He wrote on whatever he could find, the backs of torn pages, scraps of brown paper, once on the inner bark of a piece of wood that he had peeled from a dead tree behind the quarters. He wrote slowly, laboriously, his letters large and uneven, his spelling imperfect, his sentences clumsy and rough. But he wrote. He wrote the names of the people he knew. He wrote what happened to them. He wrote what he saw, and what he heard, and what he understood. He wrote about Isaiah, his father, sold in the autumn of 1839. He wrote about June, who had taught him to read and who had died of fever before she could see what her teaching would become. He wrote about Phoebe, his mother, who worked the fields from dawn to dark and sang to herself at night when she thought no one was listening, old songs, half-remembered, brought from South Carolina in her memory the way a bird carries a seed in its belly. He wrote about the bell that rang at 4:30 each morning. He wrote about the weighing of the cotton sacks. He wrote about the ration of cornmeal and salt pork, and about the hunger that lived in the belly like a second heartbeat. He wrote about the great house and its white columns and the pale woman who lived inside it and believed that God had made the world this way. He wrote, and he hid what he wrote, and he told no one. It was the summer of 1850 when everything changed. Thomas was 12 years old. The cotton was high, and the work was brutal, 12 hours a day in the Georgia heat, the sun a white and merciless eye overhead, the air thick with humidity and the smell of sweat and red earth. The field hands moved through the rows in silence, their hands picking, their bodies bent, their faces expressionless in the way that faces become expressionless when expression is too costly to maintain. Phoebe was sick. It had started as a cough, nothing unusual, in a place where illness moved through the quarters like wind through an open window. But the cough deepened, and within a week it had settled in her chest like something alive, rattling and wet, and by the middle of July she could not rise from her pallet in the morning. Thomas was permitted to stay with her during the day, a small mercy, granted by Mr. Wren without comment, the way a farmer might grant a day off to a horse with a lame leg. The work needed to be done, but a sick woman in the fields was less productive than no woman at all, and so Thomas was released from his duties to tend his mother. He sat beside her pallet in the dim, hot interior of the cabin, and he held her hand, and he listened to the sound of her breathing, labored, rasping, like air being drawn through a crack in a door. Phoebe's eyes were closed most of the time, but when they opened, they found Thomas's face with a directness that told him she was still there, still present, still the woman who had held him in the dark and whispered her name into his ear. "Thomas," she said, on the third day. Her voice was barely audible, a thread of sound in the heavy air. "Yes, Mama. You listen to me now." "I'm listening." She was quiet for a long time. The flies hummed in the window. Outside, the bell was ringing for the afternoon shift, and Thomas heard the distant footsteps of the field hands moving back toward the rows. "They ain't never gonna write you down," Phoebe said. "Not the real you. Not who you are. You understand what I'm saying?" Thomas understood. He had been understanding it for years. "You write it yourself," Phoebe said. "Whatever you got to write. You write it, and you keep it, and you don't let nobody take it from you. Promise me." "I promise, Mama." Phoebe closed her eyes. She did not open them again. Thomas sat beside her for a long time after she died, long enough for the light to change, long enough for the shadows to lengthen across the dirt floor of the cabin. He did not cry. He did not move. He simply sat, and he breathed, and he held his mother's hand until it grew cold. When the others came to take her body to the burial ground, Thomas stood and walked outside into the evening air, and he looked up at the sky, red and gold and streaked with clouds, and he felt something settle inside him. Something final. Something that closed one door and opened another. He had made a promise. He intended to keep it. The writing became Thomas's life. Not his only life. He still worked the fields, still carried messages, still did the 100 small tasks that the plantation required of him. But beneath the surface of his days, in the hidden spaces where no one looked, he wrote. He wrote in the mornings, before the bell, when the cabin was still dark and the others were asleep. He wrote in the evenings, after the work was done, by the light of a small tallow candle that he kept hidden beneath a loose board in the floor. He wrote on nights when the moon was bright enough to see by, sitting behind the cabin in the shadow of the live oak, his back against the rough bark, his hand moving slowly across whatever scrap of paper or bark or skin he had found. He wrote everything. He wrote the names of every person he knew on Willow Creek, all 131 of them, plus those who had been sold or died before his memory began. He wrote their stories as he knew them, where they had come from, how they had arrived, what had been done to them. He wrote the names of their children and the names of their parents, where those names were known. He wrote the small, daily details that no ledger would ever record, the way old Samuel sang while he worked the gin, a song in a language that no one else on the plantation understood, the way the women in cabin 7 kept a small garden of herbs behind their door, not for cooking but for medicine, passed down from mothers to daughters across generations, the way the children played in the yard after dark, in games that had no names, invented in the moment and forgotten by morning. He wrote about Mr. Wren. He wrote about Colonel Ashworth. He wrote about Mrs. Ashworth and her Sunday prayers and her quiet, unconscious cruelty. He wrote about Reverend Harmon and his sermons, and about the way the enslaved people listened to those sermons and heard something different than what the preacher intended, not salvation in the next life, but a promise that this life, this suffering, this injustice, was not the whole of the story. He wrote with care and with fury, though the fury never showed on his face or in his manner. To the world, Thomas was a quiet, reliable boy, good at his work, unlikely to cause trouble, not particularly remarkable in any way. This was precisely the image he cultivated, and he cultivated it with the same deliberation with which he cultivated his writing. He understood, by the age of 13, that invisibility was the greatest weapon available to him. The less he was noticed, the more freely he could do what needed to be done. By the end of 1850, Thomas had filled 7 scraps of paper with his writing, small, dense pages covered on both sides in his careful, uneven hand. He kept them hidden in a hollowed-out section of the wooden post at the corner of his cabin, wrapped in a piece of oilcloth to protect them from moisture. No one knew they existed. No one suspected. No one, that is, except Mr. Caleb Wren. Wren had always watched Thomas. This was not unusual. Wren watched everyone. It was his job, and he performed it with the thoroughness of a man who took his responsibilities seriously. He knew the habits of every person on the plantation, knew who drank, who fought, who stole, who prayed, who wept at night when they thought no one could hear. He knew the rhythms of the quarters the way a doctor knows the rhythms of a patient's pulse, intimately, clinically, without sentiment. But Thomas was different. Thomas was a problem that Wren could not quite solve, and Caleb Wren did not like unsolved problems. It had started years before, on that January evening in 1847, when Wren had looked up from his desk and seen, or thought he saw, a small figure standing at the edge of the tree line in the rain. He had not mentioned it to anyone. He had simply filed it away, the way he filed everything, in the careful ledger of his mind. Over the years that followed, Wren had noted other things about the boy. The way Thomas listened, not with the inattention of a child, but with the focused, absorbing concentration of someone who was recording. The way his eyes moved when he was in the great house on an errand, quick, quiet, taking in details that no enslaved child should have been taking in. The way he held himself, still, balanced, watchful, like a man standing on the edge of a cliff and calculating the distance to the bottom. Wren was not a fool. He had been an overseer for 15 years, on 3 different plantations, and he had learned to recognize the signs of what the planters called uppityness, a word that meant, in practice, any indication that an enslaved person was thinking too much, seeing too clearly, or understanding too well the nature of the system that held them. Wren had seen what happened to such people. He had, on occasion, been the instrument of what happened to them. But Thomas was subtle. Thomas was so subtle that Wren could not, for years, find the evidence he needed to act. The boy did nothing wrong. He worked hard, he kept quiet, he caused no trouble. He was, by every measurable standard, exactly the kind of enslaved person a plantation needed, productive, obedient, invisible. It was only when Wren began to notice the paper that he understood. It happened by accident. In the autumn of 1850, Thomas was sent to the smokehouse to bring a side of salt pork to the kitchen. The smokehouse door had swollen with moisture and would not open easily, and Thomas had to push hard against it, and in doing so he stumbled, and a folded piece of paper fell from the inside of his shirt and landed in the dirt at Wren's feet. Wren was standing 10 yards away, checking the progress of a repair on the smokehouse roof. He saw the paper fall. He saw Thomas's face, saw, in the space of one heartbeat, the flash of something in those dark, still eyes that he had never seen before. Fear. Real fear. The kind of fear that a man shows when something precious has been taken from him. Wren did not pick up the paper. He did not say a word. He simply looked at Thomas for a long moment, that same cold, knowing look from 3 years before, and then he turned and walked away. Thomas retrieved the paper. His hands were shaking. That night, Thomas moved all 7 of his papers from the hollow post to a new hiding place, a crack in the foundation of the smokehouse itself, sealed with mud and a piece of bark, invisible to anyone who did not know it was there. He rewrote the paper that had fallen, from memory, adding nothing and changing nothing. And he began to think, for the first time, about what would happen when Wren found the rest. Because Wren would find them. Thomas knew this with the same quiet certainty with which he knew the sun would rise. Wren was not a man who let things go. Wren was a man who kept records, who tracked every variable, who solved every problem. And Thomas with his secret papers, his hidden words, his careful chronicle of the lives and deaths and sorrows of 131 human beings, was a problem that Wren would not rest until he had solved. The plan came to Thomas in the spring of 1851, when he was 13 years old. It did not come all at once. It came in pieces, the way his reading had come, in fragments, assembled slowly, each one fitting into the next like stones in a wall. And when it was complete, Thomas understood that it was not merely a plan for survival. It was something larger. Something that went beyond his own life, beyond Willow Creek, beyond the boundaries of the plantation and the state and the century in which he lived. It was a way to make sure the story survived. The opportunity presented itself through an unlikely source, Colonel Ashworth's nephew, a young man named Fletcher Ashworth, who arrived at Willow Creek in March of 1851 from Savannah. Fletcher was 24, newly married, and possessed of a hobby that was considered eccentric but not unusual among the younger generation of Southern gentlemen. He painted portraits. Fletcher set up a studio in one of the guest rooms of the great house and spent his mornings painting, first the Colonel, then Mrs. Ashworth, then the various white visitors and neighbors who came to call. He was not talented, exactly, but he was competent, and he took his work seriously, approaching each subject with a careful attention to detail that reminded Thomas, watching from a distance, of Mr. Wren at his ledger. Fletcher also painted enslaved people. This was less common, but not unheard of. Some Southern painters included enslaved workers in their landscapes as background figures, their faces indistinct, their bodies reduced to shapes in the field. A few painted individual portraits, usually of house servants, usually at the request of their owners, and usually in a style that emphasized servility, obedience, and gratitude. The portraits were hung in hallways or stored in closets. They were, in their way, another form of the ledger, a visual record of property, frozen in oil and canvas. Fletcher painted 3 enslaved people during his stay at Willow Creek. The first 2 were house servants, a woman named Martha and a man named Eli, painted in the conventional style, their eyes downcast, their hands folded, their faces smoothed into expressions of quiet contentment. The third was Thomas. Thomas did not ask to be painted. He did not seek Fletcher's attention or volunteer for the portrait. What happened was this: Fletcher came to the quarters one afternoon in June, looking for a face, as he put it to Colonel Ashworth, something interesting, something that would make a good study. He walked through the rows of cabins, examining the faces of the enslaved people with the detached assessment of a man choosing a piece of fruit at market, until he came to Thomas, who was sitting behind his cabin mending a harness, and he stopped. "You," Fletcher said. "Come with me." Thomas went. The portrait took 3 sittings, each one lasting 2 hours. Thomas sat on a wooden stool in the guest room, his back straight, his hands in his lap, his face turned slightly to the left, the way Fletcher positioned him, adjusting the angle of his chin, the set of his shoulders, with the casual authority of a man arranging furniture. Thomas did not move. He did not speak. He sat, and he breathed, and he watched Fletcher paint. And during those sittings, during those 6 hours of stillness and silence, while Fletcher's brush moved across the canvas in slow, careful strokes, Thomas did something that Fletcher did not notice, and could not have understood if he had. Thomas looked directly into the painter's eyes. Not with defiance. Not with anger. Not with any of the emotions that a white man in 1851 Georgia would have recognized or feared. Thomas looked with something else entirely, something quieter, and deeper, and more dangerous than any of those things. He looked with the full weight of his attention, the same attention he had given to every word he had ever read, every name he had ever written down. He looked at Fletcher Ashworth the way a man looks at a mirror, seeking, in the reflection, the truth of what he was. And Fletcher, without knowing it, painted what he saw. The portrait was finished in July of 1851. It showed a boy of 13, dark-skinned, thin-faced, with large, serious eyes that held a quality that Fletcher, in his notes, described simply as remarkable. The boy's expression was not servile. It was not angry. It was not contented. It was something that Fletcher could not name, and that he did not try to name, because painters of that era did not spend much time trying to understand the inner lives of the people they painted. The portrait was hung in a hallway of the great house, where it remained for the next 44 years, noticed by some and ignored by most, and carrying, in the stillness of its subject's gaze, a weight that no one who saw it could quite explain. Thomas did not escape Willow Creek. This is important. The story of an enslaved person who finds freedom, who runs north, who reaches the free states, who lives to tell their story, is a story that has been told many times, and it is a true story, and it is a necessary story. But it is not Thomas's story. Thomas stayed on Willow Creek. He worked the fields for the rest of his life. He did not run. He did not fight. He did not, in any dramatic or visible way, resist the system that owned him. What he did was right. Between 1850 and 1863, 13 years, Thomas filled 23 scraps of paper with his careful, uneven hand. He wrote the names and stories of every person he knew on the plantation. He wrote what he saw, and what he heard, and what he understood about the world in which he lived. He wrote about the war that was coming. He heard the men talk about it in the fields, heard the tension in their voices, felt the slow tightening of something in the air that told him the world was about to change. He wrote about the day the Union soldiers came to Willow Creek, in the spring of 1865, and the way the enslaved people stood in the yard of the quarters and listened to the officer's words, "You are free," and did not move, because freedom, after a lifetime of bondage, was not something you could simply hear and believe. It had to be felt, first, in the body. And the body took time. Thomas kept writing after the war. He kept writing through Reconstruction, through the sharecropping years, through the slow and bloody reassertion of white supremacy across the South. He wrote about the people he knew, the ones who stayed on the land, the ones who left, the ones who died before they could do either. He wrote about the Great House, which burned in 1867 and was never rebuilt. He wrote about Mr. Wren, who disappeared during the war and was never seen again. He wrote about Mrs. Ashworth, who died in 1869, alone, in a boarding house in Macon. And he wrote about the portrait. Thomas knew, by the time the war was over, that the portrait Fletcher Ashworth had painted of him in 1851 was the only image of him that would ever exist. He knew that no photograph had been taken of him, no daguerreotype, no tintype. Such things were rare among enslaved people, and Thomas had never been the subject of one. The portrait was it. The only visual record of his face, his body, his presence in the world. And so Thomas made a decision. In the years after the war, when the Great House had burned and the Ashworth family had scattered, Fletcher Ashworth, who had survived the conflict, barely, and had returned to Savannah, took with him a number of paintings from the house before it burned. Among them was the portrait of Thomas. Fletcher kept it for years, hanging it in various rooms of his home in Savannah, until his own death in 1893, at which point it passed to his estate and eventually, through a series of sales and transfers that Thomas never knew about, to a private collection in Charleston. Thomas, for his part, did something else with the portrait, something that Fletcher never knew, and that no one discovered for over a century. In the spring of 1864, before the Union soldiers came, Thomas had gained access to the Great House. The Ashworths had fled, Colonel Ashworth had died in 1860, and Mrs. Ashworth had left for her sister's home in Augusta when the fighting began, and the house stood empty, its doors unlocked, its rooms dark and still. Thomas walked through the hallway where the portrait hung and stood before it for a long time. Then he took a small knife from his pocket, a paring knife, stolen from the kitchen months before, and he made a cut. A single cut, precise and careful, along the inside of the frame, just deep enough to create a pocket between the canvas backing and the wooden frame. Into this pocket he slid a folded piece of paper, one of his own writings, the most carefully composed piece he had ever produced, a document that contained not only the names and stories of the people of Willow Creek but a single, clear statement, written in Thomas's uneven hand. My name is Thomas. I was born on this land. I was not a number. I was not a value. I was a man. Remember me. He sealed the pocket with a thin strip of hide, glued with pine resin, and he hung the portrait back on the wall. Fletcher Ashworth, when he took the painting from the house later that year, did not examine the frame. Why would he? It was a portrait he had painted himself, in a room he knew well, of a boy whose name he had never bothered to learn. He carried it back to Savannah, and it hung in his home for 30 years, and no one looked behind the canvas, and no one knew. The portrait surfaced in 1927, in an estate sale in Charleston, South Carolina. A young academic named Dr. Margaret Hollis purchased it for $12. She was a historian of Southern art, specializing in the antebellum period, and the portrait interested her for its unusual quality. The subject's expression, in particular, struck her as unlike anything she had seen in portraits of enslaved people from that era. There was no servility in the boy's face, no performance of gratitude or contentment. There was simply a presence, a stillness, a weight, that seemed to communicate something that the painter had not intended to convey. Dr. Hollis studied the portrait for years. She traced Fletcher Ashworth's provenance, identified the plantation, found references to the painting in Fletcher's correspondence. She wrote a brief article about it in 1931, noting the unusual quality of the subject's expression but offering no explanation for it. The article attracted little attention. The portrait was hung in a university gallery in Columbia, South Carolina, where it remained for decades, noticed occasionally by students and scholars but never fully understood. It was not until 1989 that a conservator named Ruth Caldwell, examining the portrait for routine cleaning and restoration, discovered the hidden pocket in the frame. She found the paper. It was brittle, yellowed, barely legible in places where the ink had faded or the moisture had seeped in. But it was readable. And when Ruth Caldwell read it, when she held the fragile, folded sheet in her hands and made out the words written there in a careful, uneven hand, she understood, for the first time, what the portrait had been all along. Not just a painting. Not just a record of property, frozen in oil and canvas. But a message. A voice, speaking across 140 years of silence, saying, I was here. I was real. I was not what you wrote in your ledger. I was more than that. Remember me. The paper was preserved, analyzed, authenticated. Historians debated its provenance for years. The handwriting, the paper stock, the ink composition all pointed to the mid-1860s, consistent with the timeline of the plantation and the war. The statement itself was verified against the surviving records of Willow Creek plantation, which confirmed the existence of an enslaved male named Thomas, born approximately 1838, who remained on the property through the end of the war and died sometime in the 1890s. The portrait hangs now in a museum in Charleston. Beside it, in a climate-controlled case, is the paper Thomas wrote, preserved behind glass, its words still visible after all these years, still speaking. My name is Thomas. I was born on this land. I was not a number. I was not a value. I was a man. Remember me. Epilogue, what the silence holds. There is a photograph, not of Thomas, but of Willow Creek plantation, taken in 1895 by a traveling photographer who was documenting the landscapes of the former Confederacy. In the photograph, the great house is gone, only the foundation remains, a dark rectangle in the red earth, half covered by weeds. The quarters are gone too, though you can see where they stood, in the flattened grass and the faint discoloration of the soil. The fields stretch empty toward the river, and the live oaks still hang heavy with moss, and the light falls across the landscape in the same pale, indifferent way it has always fallen, as though nothing has changed, as though nothing here has ever mattered. But something did matter. Something happened here, 131 somethings, and then 1,000 more, across the decades and the generations, stories upon stories, lives upon lives, each one as complex and as deep and as irreducible as any life that has ever been lived on this earth. Most of those stories are gone. They were never written down. They were never painted. They were never preserved in any form that the world would recognize as history. They lived in the mouths of the people who told them, and when those people died, the stories died with them, and the silence that followed was so complete, so total, that it felt like the silence had always been there, as though there had never been any sound at all. But Thomas knew that this was not true. Thomas knew, because he had listened, because he had watched, because he had carried the weight of all those names and stories inside him for years before he found the courage to write them down, that the silence was not emptiness. It was fullness. It was a room packed so tightly with unspoken words that the air itself could barely breathe. And so he wrote. Not because he believed the world would listen. Not because he believed his words would change anything. He wrote because someone had to. Because someone always has to. Because the alternative, the silence, the forgetting, the slow erasure of an entire people from the story of the land they built, was something that Thomas, in his quiet, stubborn, unbreakable way, refused to accept. The portrait hangs on its wall. The paper rests in its case. And somewhere in the red earth of Georgia, in a burial ground behind a chapel that no longer exists, Thomas's bones lie in the dark, and the world goes on above him, and most of it does not know his name. But some of it does now. And that, perhaps, is enough.